drastic impact on women's lives abroad. But the more complicated story is that the policy itself came out of divisions within the anti-abortion movement that go back to the 1970s. A lot of people tend to think of the anti-abortion movement as this homogenous movement closely associated with the Christian right today. But if you go back to the 1970s, the anti-abortion movement itself is pretty diverse and dynamic. Atheists, agnostics, evangelicals, fundamentalist Christians, Mormons, Muslims, Orthodox Jews, various denominations of Protestant faith, and Roman Catholics all trying to get along to push an anti-abortion agenda. They don't always get along. There's a radical edge that believed a zygote, that's a fertilized egg that's then split, is a person from that moment. And they held a hard line that the law should protect them and that abortion was murder with no exceptions. Not everybody actually agrees with that. You know, they're not so sure if they want birth control to be limited that much.
So why did funding become so symbolic?
Because no matter what approach they have to what's the best way of limiting abortion, everybody could agree, let's get rid of funding, absolutely. If the anti-abortion movement's fracturing on other issues, it can always unite by going after funding. And then on top of that, the rhetoric around this strengthens alliances with, especially in the 1970s, Republican politicians. Funding campaigns drew on a rhetoric that painted the government as bad, right? So if the government's funding abortion and it might be coercing women into those abortions, we need to stop the government. And then they also have this humanitarian bent that they're standing up for the least desirable fetuses. Because funding typically would go to women on Medicaid, you know, the marginalized communities. Republican politicians know that going after abortion legislatively can cause divisions in the movement that are not necessarily the best for those Republican politicians when it comes to election time. But if you go after funding, they'll all hold together.
Now, you mentioned Republican politicians. We probably have the notion that this is and has always been a major obsession of the GOP and a rallying point, but not necessarily so. It was after Roe v. Wade, right, that Jesse Helms, the late senator from North Carolina, introduced the Helms Amendment that really opened up abortion to national debate and clarified the division between parties. Tell me about the Helms Amendment.
One of the first things he does to make his mark is to propose a rider on a budget at the last minute, so it flies under the radar, that the United States will not fund any abortions through its foreign aid. So since 1974, when it goes into enforcement, the United States government has not spent any money funding the procedure of abortions. As they gain victories, they're looking more and more for keeping the funding battle so they can keep together. So they gain the victory of the Hyde Amendment in 1976, which takes out abortion funding domestically in the United States. They begin the battle to the states, down to county levels, and even to some extent today, the funding battles are still going, and they still unite the movement and keep Republicans who are willing to do that battle with them on funding, keeps that as a close alliance.
Since you're a historian, I guess I should ask you about the domestic pressure President Reagan was under at the time, having named Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, a woman who supported women's right to reproductive self-determination.
Yes, and Reagan got a tremendous amount of flack from the anti-abortion movement and the Christian right, to the point that they actually held a huge rally against Reagan when the Sandra Day O'Connor appointment came through. The anti-abortion movement as well, in 1980, the expectation is that they would get major federal legislation through that would curb abortion access. And the anti-abortion movement itself fractured around that legislation. And therefore, by 84, nothing had really been passed at the federal level. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction, both at Ronald Reagan himself and then within the movement on the eve of the Mexico City policy.
Was the Mexico City rule, when it first appeared in 1984, just an attempt to assuage that cohort?
If you want to be cynical, that would be a major component of it, but I don't want to discount the fact that there were people in the Reagan administration who were drafting that, who genuinely held an anti-abortion position and were trying to move to protect fetal life. But if you look at the politics in the actual election, definitely Mexico City policy appeases members of the Christian right and major organizations come out celebrating it. So the National Right to Life Committee, which is one of the nation's largest anti-abortion organizations, says it's very pleased, and it's proving once again that Ronald Reagan is the pro-life president.
And now 33 years later comes Donald Trump, whose political history is such that it was as a supporter for reproductive rights. He's now fancied himself a so-called pro-lifer. Is there more significance to this particular toggle of the Mexico City order than in previous changes of party in the White House?
I will say the one difference in this toggle back and forth is the fact that you had the Women's March on Washington last weekend. Millions taking to the street for various reasons, but certainly as one of the platforms of that march, they supported reproductive rights. I do think that for the first time, the strong presence of a pro-choice protest make this toggle look slightly different, because the largest anti-abortion protest each year usually happens the same week the policy is announced. And that's the National Right to Life March, which has been going on since 1974.
I don't want to suggest that in any way that these are trivial matters at play here. Obviously they're not. But the toggle has become so predictable, so perfunctory. Does it have the meaning it had back in 1984? Or is it just sort of a trope of domestic politics? The kind of thing that gets ridiculed on Veep?
And the shame of that is, if you go abroad and look at it from their point of views, this is a policy that's really impacting women's lives abroad and impacting these organizations. Every 4 to 8 years, they're having to completely reorganize as a result of this executive action. So if I have a feeling to potentially roll my eyes, that's what comes into mind and potentially stops it.
Jennifer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jennifer Donnelly is a historian who researches the anti-abortion movement.
Coming up, the fast life and inglorious death of the phrase fake news.
This is On the Media. This is On the Media. I'm Bob Garfield.
And I'm Brooke Gladstone. And now a look at the meteoric rise and immolation of the phrase fake news. In the days following the election, the media were adrift, destabilized, craving for some explanation for how they'd gotten so much so wrong. Fake news emerged from the mists.
Tonight, faking news. Political lies spread on social media by unsuspecting users. Did it change the course of the election?
While established media outlets are brands built on accuracy, rogue websites, some masquerading as legitimate, are reporting misinformation, and it's spreading like wildfire online.
Flat out lies deemed as the truth. The fake news writer who says he is the reason Donald Trump will be in office and the guilt he feels about that now.
A seductive narrative for many. And it seemed to have data backing it up.
BuzzFeed News says fake election stories sparked more interest than real ones. BuzzFeed counted comments and shares on Facebook during the last 3 months of the campaign. It found that hoaxes and stories from biased sites far outperformed reports from major news outlets.
All but 3 of the top 20 fake news stories were anti-Clinton or pro-Trump.
Now, the #1 trending article in that time was about Pope Francis endorsing Donald Trump for president. And that wasn't even true.
Finally, it all made sense. Fake news had poisoned the well. And boy, did we want you to know it.
A major crackdown announced today by Facebook. Since the election, the social media giant has come under fire for the spread of fake news on its site.
Last weekend, a fake news story about Clinton led to a shooting in Washington, D.C.
It's now clear that so-called fake news can have real-world consequences. It's a danger that must be addressed.
But maybe it was too catchy. It started as a liberal meme, but then the right ran with it.
Fake news is whatever people living in the liberal bubble determined to be believed by the right. And of course, it's based on a complete hoax.
This is headline from the Washington Post. Russian operation hacked a Vermont utility showing risk to U.S. electrical grid security, officials say. Of course, if you got the article now, you'd see a huge correction on top. It turns out the whole thing was fake news, and not the only fake news. in that highly fake newspaper.
I think the biggest piece of fake news in this election was that Donald Trump couldn't win.
And then the reductio ad absurdum. Some news is fake. Therefore, all news is fake.
The president-elect angrily denied the claims contained in a dossier, calling it fake news.
It's all fake news. It's phony stuff. It didn't happen. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you stay categorically?
You are fake news.
Co-opted in the blink of an eye. Farewell, fake news. And don't let the door hit you on the way out. Because probably the media made too much of it to begin with. Because BuzzFeed released a new study, this time measuring whether people actually trust the news they see online. And it found that even though more than half of people get news from Facebook, just a little over a quarter of them say they actually trust it. So maybe we're not quite as gullible as we'd feared. And another study, carried out by 2 economists, found that only 15% of people even remembered seeing the fake news they read. And of those who remembered it, only half believed it, a mere 8% of the total. Not only that, but some of them claimed to remember fake news headlines that the study's authors had invented as placebos. Matthew Genskow, who co-authored that study, told us that once you account for the placebo effect, even fewer than 8% believed or even recalled them. Which leaves us where? Was fake news the great moral panic of 2016? Is it still in our midst, summoning its strength, waiting to strike again?
I think we're at the point where honestly the term has become almost meaningless.
Craig Silverman is media editor for BuzzFeed.
Today, I used it in a headline and I kind of felt bad about that, to be honest with you.
Silverman is a longtime fake news researcher and the author of the original study that many used to suggest that fake news might have swung the election. He's also the author of the more recent study that suggests that that's probably overstating the case.
We surveyed about 1,000.
We like to start out and tell a story, describe the people, describe what's going on, and then the crisis they're facing. It rises up, and then there's some resolution to it. He says it doesn't have to be a good resolution. We like it better if it is, but you know, there needs to be a story arc. And I said, there is no story arc for these folks. Their lives suck. They have hard lives. Their arcs come and go within a day. They get food today, they find a place to stay today, they don't have it tomorrow. You know, we're not talking about people who have this arc that's going to be, get this great job, my life is wonderful. Yes, I can find you a few people who are like that, but that is not the story of these poor people.
So our series launched with the question of how to tell the story. It concludes with the corollary, how to take the story in. To that end, we present the Breaking News Consumer's Handbook, Poverty in America edition, because the presence of poverty unsettles our deepest beliefs about ourselves and our fellow man. And those beliefs inevitably shape the media's narrative, whether mine or Fox News.
Your tax dollars are helping welfare recipients enjoy vacations at some very exotic destinations.
True poverty is being driven by personal behavior, not an unfair economic system. The image we have of poor people as starving and living in squalor really is not accurate. Many of them have things. What they lack is the richness of spirit. That's my opinion.
Because this is my epilogue, you'll hear an opposing view. But I hope, there's common ground in presumably uninflected U.S. Census data. So here are some foundational numbers. America's median income is $56,500. In the 48 contiguous states, the official poverty guideline for one person is $11,880. For 2 people, it's $16,020. Add a little over $4,000 for every person in a household after that. If you work full-time for the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, after deducting Social Security and Medicare, your weekly paycheck is $267.81 a week, or just under $14,000 a year, well under the poverty line for, say, a mother and her kid. Okay, now let's talk about the media. We've previously examined the myth of lazy welfare recipients. Sure, they exist, but since most working-age people on public assistance already work or live in working families, I'm guessing laziness is almost as rare as cash. But that's a guess. It's facts that should prompt skepticism of stories based on the premise of laziness. Not to mention, there's a fair chance that someday those stories may be pointing their finger at you.
40% of us will experience at least 1 year of poverty during our working years. So we really have to get over this notion that this is just a problem of a fixed group and it's a generational thing and it's about them.
Greg Kaufman is the editor of TalkPoverty.org at the Liberal Center for American Progress. For him, the red flag is the word dependent or dependency, used in contexts like this.
But you're certainly not going to eradicate poverty by creating dependency. Santa Claus is not a cure for poverty.
That's point one. Beware the word dependency, which affects a few but is used as a dog whistle to denounce both the poor and the programs that help them.
Dependent is a huge one, that people are just living off the fat of the safety net, right? And if you look at the facts, I mean, federal rental assistance, 1 in 4 eligible households receives it. And the average income for those households is $12,500 a year. If you look at federal child care assistance, 1 in 6 or 7 eligible families actually receives it. And food stamps, I think that's the biggest one that people talk about dependency with. That average recipient receives $1.41 per meal. I mean, you just aren't kicking back and living off of that.
The biggest mistake journalists make is they think that we still have a vibrant welfare system.
Kathy Eden, co-author of $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, underscores point 2. The safety net is not as solid as it is portrayed.
I just got a media inquiry yesterday, a reporter who would like to speak to me about how we can rescue people from dependence on welfare and bring them into the labor market. I get these every day. I write back, could you tell me what welfare system you're talking about? Because it's not one we have. Some reporters really get caught up in this notion that maybe we shouldn't regard the poor as so badly off because we've now given them more Medicaid. The idea that people can pay their rent with their medical card, it's nonsensical. You still need cash to survive in America.
The series' 4th episode punctured the safety net myth, but it didn't bear down on the notion of welfare dependency. So consider this. Federal cash assistance, what's called temporary assistance for needy families, is block granted to states with virtually no oversight, so states can spend it on anything they like, which apparently isn't needy families. And since that program began 20 years ago, the real value of the benefit has plunged by 20%. Now, in Connecticut, a single-parent family of 3 gets $698 a month, or about $175 a week. In New Jersey, it's $424 a month. In Florida, it's $303 a month. In Tennessee, $185 for a family of 3. Why can't we get these takers off the rolls and into work? Well, aside from there not being enough jobs that pay above the poverty line, the vast majority just can't work, because the Census Bureau says that 1/4 of the poor are kids. Roughly 14% are elderly, 13% disabled, 9% are engaged in caring for someone full-time, 8% are students, and 16% are already fully employed. That's 85%. The remainder includes many workers who are suffering through a dry spell